What is going on, everybody? Welcome to another episode of GLE. I'm really excited for my conversation today, and it's a really extremely important topic. And, GLE, we are empowering leaders with faith, love, truth, and courage. And the women on my show today definitely exhibit all of those values. Very courageous for coming on the show to talk to me about a really serious topic, and one that I think all of you, as leaders, as parents, as people in today's society, need to be informed about. So I'm thrilled to be joined by a former guest on the show, Patti Katter, and her good friend, Sarah Kennedy. Welcome to the show, ladies.
Thank you. It's so good to be back.
Yes, thank you for having me on here. I'm thankful for this opportunity.
Yeah, thank you both for joining me. And, this is a topic that's tough. It's tough to talk about. We were talking a little bit before the show, just how it's taken some time even for you two to kind of realize some of the things that you've experienced in your lives. And I want to kind of start maybe with your stories, and maybe Patti, I'll ask you to go first, only because I think it'd be good for you to kind of introduce Sarah before we pass it off to her to tell her story. But before we do, I just kind of want to prep the audience with some mindset as we're going about this topic, and why are we talking about this? And you're probably wondering, what's the topic, Phil? What are we talking about? So I'm just going to read a quick verse from Matthew 18:5-7. Whoever receives one such child in my name receives me, but whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him to have a great millstone fastened around his neck and to be drowned in the depths of the sea. Woe to the world for temptations to sin, for it is necessary that temptations come, but woe to the one by whom the temptation comes. And I start with that verse simply to say that we have a duty as leaders, we have a duty as parents, people in society, to protect those who can't protect themselves, the innocent, our children. And there's a lot of crazy stuff going on in the world these days. And without knowing the depth of evil, we as leaders can't act appropriately. And, it was Thomas Aquinas that said, he who is not angry when there is a just cause for anger is immoral. Why? Because anger looks to the good of justice. And if you can live amid injustice without anger, you are immoral as well as unjust. And so I know these women stand for justice. I do too. And we want to have a positive impact with this conversation today on a very important topic. So with that, I want to pass it over to Patti to kind of tell her story about their experience, and we'll just run with it from there.
Yeah, Phil. So it's kind of funny when you were reading that Bible verse, it just kind of threw me back to some not so good memories, honestly, of people reading the Bible verses to me. And so my story is I grew up in a Christian home. It was an independent Baptist believing church. And that's what we were told. I remember one day coming home from school. I was really little. I think I was maybe going into the third grade, possibly the second grade. I came home and went to go grab my favorite pair of green pants. Like they were super cool. They had a little place for my hammer. I was a tomboy, so I like putting my hammer in my little slot in my pants. And when I went to get my pants, like all my pants were gone. There was like not one pair of pants in my drawer, and there were all these skirts in my drawer. So I was really confused, and I was like, what is going on? And my mom, she was just like, well, we're just going to start wearing dresses now. And it's like what God wants us to do. And that was the very first moment in my life that I was like, what is going on? And I didn't understand it. I was really small. Your parents teach you things. So um, we started going to church all the time. And the church that we were going to, it was all right. Actually, the one that we first started going to was pretty good. And then we made a move, and we moved about an hour away from that church. So we started going to a new church, and that church was in mid-Michigan. And I'll just say it. It was in a place called Bridgeport, Michigan. And that church and school were quite different. it was nothing I've ever experienced before, and I would not want to experience again, quite honestly. When I was in the 5th grade, I remember going to school and having teachers just scream at the kids when they were doing wrong. One of the teachers would pick a boy up by his ears. He would throw a book across the room to hit a kid in the head with the book. And everything was looked at like it was okay. And that school was part of the church. And so it kind of fed each other. So we ended up going to the church, and because of that, I was enrolled in the school eventually. And so just in the 5th grade, I had noticed a lot of anger, and it was taught to us every day. And we had like Bible studies, and we had chapel every single day, Monday through Friday. And during these teachings and chapel and even in catechism that we had, we were always told to respect our elders. The man was the man of the house, period. No discussion at all on that. And so I learned that, first of all, you just kind of have to listen or you get in trouble. I thought it was normal for people to get in trouble like that, little kids to be in trouble like that. And as I progressed into junior high, it was progressively worse and worse because I started questioning things a little bit. You know, as a young teenager, you start questioning these things. I had a teacher, if you went to the school, you know who I'm talking about. I don't even have to say her name. She would come up to the girls and she would make sure that our dresses were long enough that they were 2 inches past our knee. We could not have a slit in the skirt at all. We had to wear these ugly things called culottes. They were like big baggy shorts all the way down 2 inches past our knees, even when we're playing sports. So it was quite interesting. And I remember the teacher telling me when I was I believe I was in 5th grade, I had a white skirt on, and she told me it was too tight if I wore it to school, that the teachers could look at me in a bad way, and so would the boys. And so my mom had to drive up to the school, bring me another outfit to change into. And that skirt was not tight. It was really cute. And it had ruffles. It was almost down to my feet practically. It was that long. So I remember meeting Sarah at school. And during our school years, we weren't real close because Sarah was very shy. Sarah, I remember just her blushing, just, you know, if anybody says hi, I was like, oh my gosh, she's so sweet. She blushes and she's quiet. And I didn't realize until later why that was. But a lot of the girls, we were taught, you know, that we're supposed to obey our husbands. We're supposed to be looking for a husband that's biblical. I don't really remember ever being taught a proper way to date somebody. I was always told, you know, you have to set a Bible's length away from a boy, no touching each other at all, no shaking their hand, no, you know, giving your friend a hug. And so I never dated in school, which was really abnormal, I think, for any kid. Even to go through high school and not date. So it was a quite different lifestyle. And there's a lot to it. There's things like they had corporal punishment if you did something wrong. One time I was writing a note in class and my teacher had me go down to the office for swats in front of her husband. And she went to swat me with a board and I quick moved away from the chair. And so I was suspended from school for 30 days. And that same teacher came to my house to read me Bible verses every day, Monday through Friday, and tell me how I was sinful. I had a tongue like a two-edged sword, and like all these things about how I was going to go to hell because I didn't have my life right with Christ. And it was very warped. And I know I've talked a lot. I just wanted to kind of set that foundation because there is a lot to our stories. But I did want to set that foundation and then go ahead and introduce Sarah and see if you have any questions too.
Yeah, before we go to Sarah, I think that's a great sort of baseline for just some of the warped things you went through. I know hearing you tell, you know, I've heard bits and pieces of it or read or whatever online, but hearing you tell that story, Patti, all these things go off in my head of just like, wait, what happened? It's just like, and for someone like you to think growing up, like this is how school is, or this is just normal, like that is like horrifying to me to think that you had to experience that. So, if that's just the baseline of where we're headed today, if you're listening out there, I'm sure, you can imagine some of the things that we're going to talk about. But, I think it's really important that as we go into this, we think about people and just how people are so sinful, right? We are sinful people in a sinful world. And, the, the environment that you were in, to be in an environment that's supposed to be safe, supposed to be loving, trusting, God-centered, and to experience something so opposite, and to really, not even be able to realize that, because you didn't have anyone, you didn't have the teaching going on to even know the truth of how that behavior is so anti what it said it was supposed to be, right? That it's just horrifying, the hypocrisy there. So,
Yeah.
thank you for sharing that with us. I know it can't be comfortable to share some of those things, and it's just bizarre.
Yeah,
It's like coming from another planet for me.
Yeah, I've never even talked about it on my podcast. And so when you asked me, I was like, oh, okay, I'll do it because I know it's important. Parents usually send their children to these schools for protection and to get away from the public school system. And they really put their faith into the school, into the church. And somehow things just get skewed. And I can see where it did in my parents. Like I can see where it went wrong for them. And I don't know if you want to talk about that now or.
Yeah, well, let's pass over to Sarah. I want to hear some of her story too, just so the audience has some perspective of just a couple examples of things that, kids all across America, I know Patti and Sarah aren't the only ones, right? Kids are experiencing things like this and far worse, right under our noses, in our communities, in our families, in our churches. I know I have people that I'm close with that have had family member, issues with family members, right? Even beyond, right? And we're going to talk a little bit maybe about family too. So Sarah, why don't you tell your story, and we'll just go from there.
Okay. My story starts out pretty much the similar as Patti's. We went to the same church, we went to the same school. I think we were just a year apart. So it's funny, it's funny now, but we were talking this morning about how, when we were like in third and fourth grade, the school was so little that one teacher taught third and then would, teach the other half of the class fourth grade. And, she's right. I noticed back then, teachers, she's right, picking up kids by the ears and dragging them down the hall and throwing books, and not, a light toss, but, throwing a book enough to get a kid's attention. And the dress code, we, once we got to high school, it was, constant monitoring of what we were wearing. It was constant, I got in trouble for wearing white also, just like Patti did. And the difference in our stories is that my relatives were on the staff. My uncle was the principal of this school. And so I was considered a staff kid. My dad was a teacher. My aunt was a teacher. So, I am at school with my uncle, who's the principal, and my aunt, who's a teacher, my dad, who's a teacher. And, it was instilled on us that how we looked as girls directly related to how a boy's thoughts were. A boy, you don't want a boy to have impure thoughts. It was on us to maintain their thoughts. And, I had that's just the way we were taught. And it was ingrained in us constant. They didn't teach sex education in a Christian school. Like Patti said, sometimes, people are sending their kids to a private Christian school to shelter them. And I think that we were sheltered. Definitely. I grew up sheltered. But at the same time, you would have that gut instinct, like something isn't right about this, but you couldn't question it, because why are you going to question the man of God? Why are you going to, question what the adults are telling you? And we had chapel every single day. On Wednesdays, they would load us teenagers up in the bus and we would go knock on doors to spread the gospel to our town. It was constant service. We'd go to the nursing homes, we'd sing, we'd go to camp. I mean, it was a 24/7 type of living, at least for me it was. And
Same.
yeah, it was 24/7, and the thing that, it was such a mind confusing thing, because you'd go home and, it was very adamant that when you're out, when you're at church, when you're at school, we have to, maintain this level of Christianity that everybody wants, that everybody is looking up to. And being a staff kid, I can remember being asked, what are the other kids doing? Have any of them done anything bad? And Patty's right. I stayed shy. I stayed quiet for a reason, because I wanted to be under that radar. I didn't want the extra attention came from my uncle being the principal. So I kept to myself. I didn't really, I tried to just be nice to everybody. I never did tell on anybody because I just didn't think that that was the right thing to do. But the clothes, the way, covering up, we had separate swimming spots, when we would go to camp. The boys would be on the opposite side of the lake, girls on the opposite side of the lake. And, we were allowed to wear our swimsuits, but we had to wear those culottes and t-shirts over them. And I grew to be like almost ashamed, I'm ashamed of my body. Like what's wrong that, I can't swim with my girlfriends. Like, that, like you said, like that's something that doesn't make sense to a lot of people, but that is how we grew up.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of, part of my story is just, we our youth pastor really wanted to start a ministry to public school boys. And so he would take a group of us girls to the public school football games, and we would watch the football games. And then after the games, the boys that would come talk to us, those are the ones that we were to invite to church. And I did that. I helped, invite these boys to church, because again, that's, it's two-sided. They're telling you your skirt's too white, and at the same time, they're basically using you as bait to attract these public school boys to come to church. But it worked. I mean,
Wow.
there were, and there's, there are a lot, it worked. These boys would come to church, and, you know, it became a thing when I got towards 10th, 11th, and 12th grade, that as girls, it was almost like you were on a high level of spirituality if you dated one of these boys. These were the preacher boys. That was their label. They were the preacher boys. They were one day going to be in full-time service to God. They had dedicated their lives to God. One day they already knew they wanted to be a pastor.
Mm-hmm.
And I was fine with that. That's good. Back then I thought that's great. I got to keep up this appearances. I got to, date these preacher boys.
Mm-hmm.
So I did, I dated, that was what you did. You wanted God's hand on your life. And as a girl, if you're taught the husband or your one day future husband is in charge,
Mm-hmm.
why not? Of course you're going to want to be with a preacher boy, right? That's the highest level of spirituality you can get in a mate. And that was the perception that was around us constantly. And I was talking to Patti about this before, but like, what about those other kids that didn't get that label as preacher boy? They were treated as rebellious.
Mm-hmm.
It was
I
one
was,
or the other.
yeah, I was one
Right.
of those kids. Yeah, I
Yeah.
didn't want to date a preacher boy.
And she got that label. I
Yeah.
mean, I heard it myself from adults. Like,
Mm-hmm.
Patti is, there'd be a certain group of girls that, it was like, oh, they're the rebellious ones because they weren't doing anything wrong. But, maybe not dating a preacher, or maybe not, maybe something would come up on a Wednesday and you couldn't go out, handing out tracts. Um, I mean, you were sinning if you weren't on that bus handing out tracts and witnessing to people. So just the whole culture of it was, for us girls what we wore, but yet let's go gather up
Mhm.
some boys, you know,
Right.
like imagine trying to figure that out as a teenage girl. Like, you can't wear this, but hey, I'll use you to go gather up some boys, you
Yeah.
know.
That's
um
totally straight up
it
evil.
it's so polarizing in your head that, I'm causing a boy to sin if I dress wrong, but yeah, it's okay for me to go bring a boy to church.
Hmm.
It just, and these boys ended up attending the school too. So
Hmm.
they would get scholarships with people donating money or whatever through the church. So they would, be at the school, they joined our school too
Hmm.
at some point. But we would go to camp around campfires. We were just, it was never, I can't remember ever being told like God loves you no matter what. I can't
Right.
remember ever being told that, you're a kid, you're going to mess up. I'm an adult, I mess up.
Hmm.
We were never told that. No teacher authority figure ever said, okay, you're okay to mess up and God forgives you. I
Right.
can't remember ever being told that. So it was like a
So,
constant state of fear.
yeah, I think this is such an important thing. And I hate to interrupt you because you're
No,
doing a
it's
great job
okay.
telling the story, but this is such an important thing it is the biggest thing that is confused in Christian teaching. And it's the doctrine of law and gospel. And when you see error, you see a preaching of law, a preaching of rules. Oftentimes, I think kind of what you're describing, at least it sounds like this is what I'm hearing, is it's a law of man. It's a man-made created law that's not really God's law, but it's all these, it's like the Old Testament Pharisee rules of, oh, you can't pick grain on Sunday because it's the
Right.
Sabbath and you got to rest, right? Like it's all these little bitty nitpicky things that totally miss the whole purpose of the Sabbath rest. Just like, oh, wear this uniform and oh, you can't wear this. Oh, but in hindsight, I'm going to use you to basically prostitute yourself almost to like bring boys into the
Right.
church, right? Like what?
Right.
So, I think I hate to just start dropping advice in here, but what would you tell yourself? Because one thing that stood out to me that you said is something felt wrong in your gut, and I really think call it your conscience, call it the Holy Spirit. I've really begun to trust my gut, and like if something feels wrong, it's like my spirit's talking to me, and when something feels wrong, I'm usually right. I'm usually right that something's wrong. So what, like if somebody right now out there is feeling like, hey, something's not right about this, what advice would you give them, Sarah?
I mean, you're talking about like in the church, right? If
I'm
they're in a
talking
church
in general,
situation, just in
in any
general.
situation, right? Like
I mean,
as you
if
think back
somebody
to
would,
your experience
right,
going through those feelings.
right, you have to speak up and you have to go to somebody. And that's the hardest thing to do.
Yeah.
I mean, so
Well, and who do you go
if,
to if the people you would
and
go
who do you
to
go
aren't
to?
trustworthy,
Right.
right?
Exactly. Who do you go
Brutal.
to? You're going to start Googling or start looking for, some other help. And I think that is part of the problem because, you know, I can look back at all my relationships after, I finished telling the rest of my story. I can look back at those and it was a direct result of this previous thing that happened in my life. And I got to the point where I didn't, my red flags were gone. My gut feeling was gone. It was just, this is the way it is. And you have to find somebody that you can trust first. But if you can get over that first step and say something, and I would, for Patti and I back then, there was nobody we could go to. There wasn't, I remember trying to go to people,
Right.
and nothing happened.
Yeah.
So maybe that's another reason why this podcast that you're doing is so important because,
Mhm.
if we can share our stories and we experienced it a long time ago, but we're here for people.
Yeah,
There's got to be somebody that you can trust, and you just have to speak up. And if you don't, I understand. Like I said, it's taken me this long to get to this point.
sure.
And
And it's hard.
Sarah,
Even yeah, it's hard.
yeah, Sarah, would you mind sharing you were talking about the preacher boys and kind of share what happened, because she did reach out, and there were a lot of people a lot of kids tried reaching out for help, and Sarah's going to show a prime example, or tell a prime example of that.
Yeah, dive in. Sorry to interrupt you.
So no, it's okay. So I guess I am kind of a prime example of how things happen and you try to get help and it doesn't. So I was dating one of these preacher boys, and you know, maintaining my modesty, maintaining the 6-inch rule, maintaining all these rules that have been taught to me. I didn't try to overtly be a rule breaker as far as what I wore, or, you know, but I did, it was ingrained in us that, if you are impure in any way, shape, or form, whether it's kissing, holding hands, like Patti said, you couldn't hug a friend if it was of the opposite sex. You are impure, and God wouldn't use you. And that was ingrained in us over and over and over, that impurity means God's done with you, and his hand isn't on your life. And I grew up in a Christian home my whole life, and I knew I wanted that. Like, I knew I wanted God's hand on my life. So I did maintain purity. I mean, I didn't hold hands. I didn't kiss. We weren't allowed to date alone. We couldn't go anywhere alone. We couldn't, it wasn't, let's go to the park and walk around even in public. It was, you had to have constant supervision and chaperone. So I did start dating one of these guys, one of these preacher boys from the public school, and he did start going to our school, and he didn't live that far from my house. And my parents would let me go over there under the condition that his parents were home. And so I always made sure, not having cell phones back then, I would call and, are your parents home? And it would always be yes. And I'd go over there and his parents would be home. And as I, when I was thinking of what happened back then, I can see how he was slowly, gradually pushing these boundaries that I had, the no touching boundary started being innocent tickling, like, is that, in your head, is that really wrong? Is it not? It didn't seem wrong. So, it would slowly, cross these lines to where, I think that just it's so opposite of what you're, in your head, you're not supposed to touch, you're not supposed to kiss. And then, is a tickle bad? Is it not? And it gets very confusing. It gets confusing in your head as to what is right and what's not, and what's godly and what's not, and what's impure and what is, pure. So,
right.
I had already graduated from high school. It was the summer before I was getting ready to go to college. And one day I went, my parents were allowing me to go to his house. And this is one thing I know, how he was grooming me. He would never come to my house ever. I would ask him. I remember one time I asked him, like, hey, let's go to my house, and he got mad and angry and said no. So I never asked again. But he lied to me one day and said that his parents were home. And I got inside and I freaked out. Oh no, this is not good. And it wasn't so much in my mind that something bad's going to happen. It was, oh no, I'm being impure. His parents aren't here. We're alone. Like, just the thought of being alone really frightened me. And I was fearful that I was sinning, over that. And so I told him, like, look, when your parents come home, I can come back, or I can come back another day. And it was, no, it's fine. It's fine. And, and at the same time, he was slowly crossing these lines with me. And when I started dating him, I was a virgin. I had not even kissed a boy. And I'm 16 years old. I hadn't even held a boy's hand. And
good for you, by the way.
I mean, but I was afraid, sure. Like, I didn't want to go to hell.
Yeah, it's horrible that they told you the wrong why, right? But like, that's what sucks about it.
I mean, I think Patti can agree to that. I mean, it was, right. You're right. They didn't teach the why. It was just you're sinful.
Right. Yeah.
So, like I said, and this boy was well known, very well known, because he was a preacher boy. He was one of the good ones. He was, so he invited me over that day, and his parents were not home. And, he convinced me that it was okay. And, and I was thinking back on the details of it, because I do remember every detail. He put my car in his garage, which I thought was unusual. And so after that, we were alone and he did rape me. And when I went home and tried to tell my father, my dad, his immediate response was, okay, we're going to talk to the pastor of the church. Um, my mom was waiting for me that night because we also had very, very strict curfew. We could not, it was, for me, if it was, you're supposed to be home at 10 and it was 10:01, you were grounded for the next week. Um, so that night I was late, and I had a stick shift car and I kept stalling it out trying to get home, and we only lived about 3 miles apart. And when I got home, my mom was waiting for me, and she was already, kind of mad because I was late. But when she saw my condition, she immediately changed. And I was hysterical. And she just hugged me and let me lay in her lap. And it woke my dad up. And remember, my dad was a teacher. So, my uncle's the principal, my dad's a teacher at this school. And, he wanted to know what was going on and why had I woken him up. And um, he at some point got me the next morning. He kind of asked me what had happened, and I told him everything. And he was like, okay, do not tell your mom, she can't handle this. We're going to go talk to the pastor. And
Yikes.
me, in my mind, I thought talking to the pastor meant I was going to get help. I thought that meant, okay, let's go talk to the pastor about this. And this was the pastor of that church in Bridgeport. And so now it was a Saturday because that was a Friday night. And we get to the church, and of course, he's the only one there because it was a Saturday. Just the pastor was there. And we go back into his office, my dad and, me start talking to the pastor. And I immediately started getting questioned of, what did I do? What was I wearing? What did I do to cause this? And I didn't even know how to answer the questions. I didn't even know what to say. And so he answered them for me, and he said, well, this happened because you're sinful. This happened because, you know, you're not saved, basically, is what he said. He said, this only happened because you're not saved. If God was in your life, this would have never happened. If you were doing what's right, this would have never happened. And at that point, something started changing in my head, that I wasn't getting help. I was I was getting in trouble. I was getting in trouble for this. And so the pastor said that, since this happened, since I was raped, that I needed to get saved. And back then I didn't know I really didn't even understand what the word rape was, but I knew enough to explain to them exactly what happened, and I knew it wasn't right. Like, I
Mm-hmm.
knew it wasn't right. And
Mm-hmm.
so I say this, I prayed the sinner's prayer. I got, he said this happened because I was sinful, and that I was saved and I was going to hell. So I prayed the sinner's prayer, which is, asking God to forgive me of my sins. And so I did it. I asked God to forgive me of my sins, and I had to repent. And the pastor baptized me after I did that. Remember it being freezing cold water because it was a Saturday. So the Baptist, the heater wasn't turned on the baptistry yet. So he took me in there and baptized me, and then that was it. And the only thing that they said to me after that was not to tell my mom. Don't tell
Wow.
anybody else. We've dealt with this. You've repented, and we're done with this. And I remember
Wow.
asking about the boy, well, what's going to happen to him? And they were like, he's fine. Don't, it was basically like, he's fine. We've already dealt with him. And I'm thinking, how did you already deal with him when this just happened last night? So when I got back home, my dad and I drove in silence home because I was just bawling my eyes out that I couldn't believe that I was being told that I was sinful and God wasn't in my life, because that was the one thing I wanted. I wanted God in my life, and I wanted to be in the ministry, and here this happened, and it was my fault. And I got home, and I finally had enough courage to just tell my mom. I didn't care if they told me not to tell her. The pastor and my dad were like, don't tell her. I told her anyway. And she immediately gathered me up. She went in my room. We took my clothes from the night before, put them in a garbage bag, and we went straight to the Bridgeport Police Department. And I filed a report. And they took the report, they took it. And then they asked my mom to talk to me alone for a few minutes. So my mom left, and they started telling me again, and here again, my hope is up again. Like, okay, the police are going to do something, the police are going to find, my pastor and my dad aren't helping me. The police will help me. And I recognized one of the police officers, as attending our church. And it never dawned on me in that moment that he would not help me. It never dawned on me the police officer wouldn't help me. And so they started kind of yelling at me, telling me that I was lying. They said, "Isn't this guy your boyfriend? Like, we know who," they knew who he was from the church. This is your boyfriend. You're basically accusing him of rape. A boyfriend doesn't rape you. And I'm like, yes, he did. Like, this is what happened. And they said I was lying and filing a false police report. So they told me that they were going to put me in jail. They said, you're going to go to jail for this. If you filed this false report, you're lying about him. I remember them even saying, "Oh, he's a good boy." And I'm just thinking, he is not, in my head, I'm thinking he is not a good boy. But I didn't want to go to jail. Like, they had me terrified that I was going to go to jail for filing this false report, as they claimed. And so I asked for my mom to come back in the room, and I told her, I was like, they're telling me I'm lying. And she was like, take her clothes. Here's evidence. There were a couple other signs, and that I had been raped, and they just were like, "Nope, boyfriends don't rape girlfriends."
Wow.
And again, threatened her, "We're going to put your daughter in jail." So she just was like, "Let's leave." And she even took me to the doctor right then and there, took me to the doctor, as she should. She did what she had to do and what was right.
Mm-hmm.
And then about a week later, my dad sent me away to a completely another state because I was a troubled teenager. I was a troubled girl. And, there's a lot. I told that very short, but, there's a lot that just went into that whole thing because it was quick.
Mm-hmm.
It happened on a Friday. I'm telling the pastor and my dad on a Saturday. And then the next week I'm in Indiana. I'm out of the state. I'm not even in Michigan anymore. And it was very confusing. And like you said, you asked that question, who do you go to? I didn't have anybody to go to because the ones I went to just brushed it away.
It makes me sick.
The rug.
Makes me sick, Sarah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah,
and God bless you for getting through and overcoming what you've been through. Because I can't even imagine. I was getting emotional while you were telling that story because I got a 2-year-old baby girl, and I just I cannot imagine not protecting my little girl and standing up for some punk kid who would do that to my little girl and brush it under the rug and not have communication with my spouse, and just the perversion of teaching throughout your whole story of all those things that you were told, the lies. And parents out there, if you're listening, the importance of getting around people that you would trust your kids with, people that if your kids don't feel comfortable coming to you, that if your kids go to them, or you have created an environment where they have a good enough relationship with the right people that they can go to, that you trust. It makes me sick just to think that you had nobody. And everywhere you went, they pointed back at you.
That's right.
And Sarah was not the only one who reached out to me after I wrote on Facebook. There were several women.
Really?
Same story, different decade, same teachers. It's horrible. And some of them are still there. Some of them are still in the quote unquote ministry. Some of them have moved. Some of them aren't, at the church anymore. But I do see some of my old classmates sending their children to that school. And I think, what are you doing? Because some of the teachers are still there. Some of the students who were participating in that are teachers now.
Right.
And it's scary.
100%. And we've been talking all about religious institutions. I really want to highlight this because I have some guilt going around in my heart just from, remembering things from my high school days and, knowing, like, I've had a couple teachers from my school years that ended up in prison for sexual relations with students, and some that I know had sexual relations with students that didn't end up in prison. And, this isn't a Christian or religious school thing only. This is a people thing broadly, an environment wherever there's people. And the horrible thing about the religious one is that the lies and the teaching going along with it that just pervert the actual truth of the grace, the forgiveness, the comfort, the love that Sarah and Patti never received, where, in the place where they're supposed to be able to receive it, and the reason they're there, right? And I hear you talk about dating and modesty and chaperoning your kids. When I interrupted you and said good for you that you were a virgin, I really mean that. And what makes me sick is you wanted to do what was right. All you wanted to do was do what was right and have a good relationship with God, and you were seeking it. And God says, seek and you will find, knock and it will be opened unto you. And it sounds like the devil croucheth at the door and, put some huge obstacles in your life, stumbling blocks. And, I'm just thankful to God that he's brought you through to where you are today.
Yeah. And this, this guy, like I said, they sent me out of the state for a month, to talk to doctors or get better, whatever they thought was going to happen to me. But when I did end up going to college, none of these adults believe, this is the thing. They did believe me. They did believe me. They just didn't want it to be reported, or they didn't want other church members to know. I mean, it wasn't, it was clear that, I knew my dad believed me. The signs in me physically and emotionally were evident. It was definitely something that they believed, but they didn't want it to be discussed. They didn't want to ruin that reputation. My uncle being the principal of this school, I mean, that can't come out. My dad being a teacher, that can't come out, and they swept it under the rug because they didn't want it to be talked about. If telling me don't tell your mom, don't talk about it with anybody because it's dealt with, and it was church dealt with in their mind. But this guy, since they did not deal with him, I mean, he followed me to college. He stalked me at college. He would call my dorm at 3 o'clock in the morning telling me he was going to kill himself. I mean, it continued for quite a long time until he moved on to the next girl. And, that breaks my heart because there shouldn't have been a next girl. There shouldn't have been anybody else. And if they would have just done what they were supposed to do.
Yeah. Your parents, pastors, teachers, whoever, police.
The police.
Yeah. Horrible. I'm reminded, I'm thinking of, y'all know I'm always pointing to the scripture and truth in the Bible, but I believe it's truth. And when it talks about an overseer, and you mentioned your uncle was the principal.
Correct.
So, if anyone aspires to the office of overseer, this is directed kind of at pastors, right? So this goes to that pastor too. He desires a noble task. He must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not a drunkard, not violent, like your teachers were, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money, must manage his own household well with dignity, keeping his children submissive. For if someone does not know how to manage his own household, how will he care for God's church? He must not be a recent convert, or he may become puffed up with conceit and fall into the condemnation of the devil. Moreover, he must be well thought of by outsiders, so he may not fall into disgrace, into a snare of the devil. Now, that can be taken in a totally perverted way, like you experienced, right?
Yeah.
Like, you submit to me. I'm the guy in charge, right?
Right.
But the converse of it is when you have evil behavior going on at those levels, those folks are not fit to lead. And I say that not only in church leaders, I say that in many other leaders. And not that we aren't all sinful and don't all mess up, but if you are accountable for other people and their souls and their everlasting salvation, it says what you need to be, right? And again, that doesn't mean you don't forgive sin, but there's a higher, you're held to a higher standard in those roles, and to see it perverted, you see what happens, which is just utter evil terribleness that you're describing. So what else from your story do you think might help people that maybe experienced or are experiencing what you've went through, that we should share before we maybe kind of try to talk about some ideas that parents and folks can take away to, really to take action if some of this stuff might be going on in their communities, or to prevent it from going on?
So what people that might be in that situation can do for themselves to,
Or
is that what you
things you experience that you think, other things from your story maybe that we haven't hit on. I don't know, Patti, anything else that you can think of after hearing Sarah's story that might be important for the
I mean,
audience to hear?
there's so much, we would go to camp, it was a big thing to go to summer camp. And again, it was just many hours. I don't know how many hours throughout the day and night that we were preached to. We did, get to have our swimming time on separate sides of the lake. And,
Mm-hmm.
we were camp, we had cabins, and, we played paintball, we had fun. But they would build these huge bonfires. I don't know if Patti remembers this or if
Yeah, I
she
do.
ever went,
I
but
do.
they
I
would
did.
build these huge bonfires and have us out there. This would be after the message.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so it's already going on 9 o'clock at night, and it wasn't. So we'd go out to these big bonfires after having these sermons preached to us, and there was so much peer pressure to repent. Like I remember one year, my thing that I was giving up and repenting of was that I had bought a teen magazine. And I remember feeling so guilty because I mean, we couldn't look at magazines.
Mm-hmm.
Those were ungodly, those were worldly. And I remember, I could drive, and I wanted to, what's this big hype about? What's a teen magazine? So I bought one, and I didn't think anything of it. But then when we got to camp, and it's, you can't have this, so let's burn your pants, let's burn the shorts, let's burn the CDs, let's burn all this stuff. I didn't think that magazine was wrong. I didn't see anything overtly sexual in it that maybe they were thinking would be in it. But I tossed it in there, and it's so I knew there was going to be a bonfire because we always had one. And so I'm going to get rid of this because I don't want to be sinful anymore. And, I was not, I mean, the first time I wore pants, I was, like 25 years old. Um, because it was, sinful. And I think the one thing is that these things that they were constantly telling us were sinful and that were bad or rebellious,
Mm-hmm.
there was nothing wrong with them,
Mm-hmm.
and it was a way to control what we did, what we thought, almost. I mean, I'll go as far as saying brainwashing. I mean,
Yeah.
if like me, I'm petrified. I'm not going to touch a boy. I'm not going to hold hands. I'm not going to kiss, but it's okay to be sexually assaulted. And to try to wrap your brain around that is really hard. And that's partly why it's probably taken me this long to actually unwrap it, because
Mm-hmm.
it's affected everything, like how I go to church now,
Right.
how I mean, I've had to, come to a different relationship with God because I've realized that the God I grew up with, that is
Wasn't God.
not, that's not God. No, that is not God. And so I'm thankful for that. I'm thankful that I've been able to work through that, but it wasn't easy.
Mm-hmm.
And to realize that God is a loving God,
Mm-hmm.
He's forgiving. He loves us no matter what. You know what, Patti, if you wore a white skirt, God still loved you. That was never told to us.
Mm-hmm.
That was not something that we were
Mm-hmm.
ever shown, that there's love and forgiveness. It was just hell and damnation, and you're
Mm-hmm.
sinner. And I think that that is a huge part of this, because you grow up believing a certain way that is completely wrong. It's
Mm-hmm.
not even just wrong, it's false. It's
Mm-hmm.
not biblical.
Yeah, it's
And
what Jordan Peterson calls it's worse than a lie. It's an anti-truth. It's like the
right.
complete opposite of truth. It's like so false. It's like the total opposite of truth.
Right.
It's the worst kind of lie.
It is.
Yeah.
And
And
you're right. You know,
for me, it was completely different. As far as Sarah, she was always looked at as one of the good girls. I was always the inquisitive one that had all the questions. And I would just nag my parents, like, do I have to go to school? I hate school. I hate it. I mean, they had ridiculous rules. Like, you can't have, back in the day, it was like the late 80s, early 90s. I can't have big hair, and I wanted big hair, darn it. Um, but finally, my parents listened, because they were seeing that I was so strong-willed and so hard-headed,
Mhm.
honestly, that I wasn't going to do good in that school any longer. And my grades were suffering. I hated it there. I literally hated it there. There was one teacher that everybody loved. He protected his students. But even if we told him, it was like he couldn't really do anything for whatever reason. And I remember the last straw for my dad was, they told my dad he could no longer have a beard because he had a really nice looking beard. It was short and trimmed and everything, but they said he could not do that anymore. Men had to be clean shaven or he couldn't be a deacon. So for him, that was that was his, like, okay, I'm done. I believe you now.
Right? Didn't
And my
Jesus have a
dad,
beard?
yeah, right. And my dad probably would have, literally, he would have killed a boy if a boy would have touched me. And I believe that protected me. Like,
Yeah.
that was my saving grace. He literally would have killed for his daughter. He was equally as stubborn as me.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that, looking back at your original question of, like, what can you do, I guess, or what are the signs? Is that what was your last question? I kind of got sidetracked here.
Yeah, I was trying to maybe I don't trying to pull out, like, based on you got all these stories, and we can't talk forever, but there's so many good things that might be relatable to somebody who's going through a crazy situation, and you've done an excellent job, both of you, of hitting on some of the high points. So one of the questions was, is there anything else you want to relate that might be relatable
Oh
and,
yeah.
and raise flags for people?
Yeah.
And then two, are there, as you think back, you've mentioned some red flags. Are there other sort of red flags people, those gut checks that people
Yeah.
can sort of hit on, right?
So I've been really diving into this because I've been working with a mentor. And now I will just be really honest with you and your listeners. I have almost withdrawn from everything to do with church. I haven't been to church in years. When I hear somebody reading the scripture, it still gives me like this ugh
Yeah.
feeling. And I've been trying to work through that, but I still have a very, very difficult time. And some of those red flags that I did see at the beginning were the instant fast changes where I felt like my family was not happy anymore. My mom and dad were arguing about the stupidest things looking back. And anything that causes that much contention, I guess, in your family,
Mm-hmm.
anything that causes that much, the feeling of just being kind of torn apart, those are red flags, because I do know, even though, like I said, I am definitely not a strong Christian anymore, from what I would say out loud. But I would say that he doesn't want your family to be all torn apart, right? He doesn't want you to feel such anxiety that you're like dragging your feet out the door to go to church. You're scared to go to church. You're scared to go to school. And if your kids are telling you, like, this is a scary environment for me, listen to your kids. Don't think they're just don't want to go to school because they hate
Mm-hmm.
school. It's more than that. Like, ask questions, ask your kids, what's going on.
Right.
I always asked my kids when they were little, what was the best thing that happened in school? What was the worst thing that happened in school? And have those conversations and listen, not to get angry, but to find out what's really going on.
Mm-hmm. I think that's great advice. You know, you both kind of hit on the brainwashing and the kind of the programming. And I think we all, whether we know it or not, everybody has experienced that from all the external factors we deal with today. Maybe not in the same way as you two, but if you're feeling shame and fear all the time, fear is not of God. Fear is, you know, we've been given a spirit of power and hope and a sound mind. And the fruits of the Spirit are love, joy, peace, kindness, patience, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control, right? So if you're in an environment that you're feeling anti those things or experiencing anti those things around you, you know that those aren't fruits of the Spirit, right? And so like that's just such a huge red flag to me, and just a gut check of like, okay, I'm hearing these words that say these things, whether they're Bible verses or like you were saying, Patty, like you hear Bible verses and it like makes you cringe, you know, that like I could understand how you out of a total hypocrite evil person's mouth, they're like reciting the scripture to you, telling you things, and you know their behavior is completely anti fruits of the Spirit.
And for
right?
years, every day, for hours and hours and hours every
Oh,
day. And you go to school Monday through Friday, you're there. You stay after school, you go to
right.
church Wednesday night, Sunday morning, Sunday
Sure.
night. I mean, there's no break. It's just it's a cult is what we were raised in.
Mm-hmm.
And you're right. You know, we would hear these things like joy, peace, love, and then the next sentence you're like fire, hell, brimstone, and you're
Right.
as a kid you're like, what is going on?
Yeah. I do think that, you know, I think it is a brainwashing technique, because I think whenever something's taking away your identity in who you are and who God made you to be, and keeping you locked
Yes.
in a fearful, shameful mindset, you know, it is programming. It's and what's interesting is you both had really different experiences, but they were both creating that shame environment and fear environment in different ways. You know what I
Absolutely.
mean?
I was scared to have a boy even touch me. And I'm still very, like, those who know me, I usually cover up, you know. I just started getting a little brave, and I'll do social media pictures, not anything risky or anything like that. But I even get really nervous and afraid to do that. But as a podcaster, I know I have to put myself out there. So it's a challenge for me, to even think like, you know, that what if somebody looks at me in the wrong way? And I shouldn't think that. I mean, as a child, throughout your whole life, you shouldn't worry about how others are viewing you. Really, I've learned that, you know, what's most important is what's in your heart. And it really is.
100%. 100%. So as we're kind of wrapping this up, because this is such deep stuff. This is a really important, deep topic, and we need to talk about it, as uncomfortable as it may be, especially for the folks who experienced it and are putting themselves out to the world, like you, Sarah and Patty. Thank you again. God bless you for being willing to put yourselves out there in the hopes that others might be helped, others might come forward. If y'all are experiencing any of this and need somebody you can trust or talk to, you can always come to me, but you can find Patti at Patti Katter, PATTIKATTER.com, or Sarah Kennedy, SARAH, Sarah with an H, Kennedy, on Facebook. And I'm sure they would love to help you, connect you with people who can help you. You know, having people in your circle, I can't emphasize this enough, people who actually exhibit the fruits of the Spirit that we were just talking about, right? And they're hard to find, but seek them out. Seek and you will find. They're out there. There's really good people out there, and there's good schools. There's really good schools. But you know, I just want to emphasize how important as a parent, and I feel this, you know, seeing what's going on in the world, seeing the perverted, pedophile, freak show weirdos that are molesting children in public, like horrifying. And it's all you can do to not, want to take the law in your own hands and do some vigilante Batman stuff, right? Like, but God will judge, right? We have governments for a reason. We have police and the law for a reason, and rule of law matters. So, I definitely not encouraging any of that, but you, me, Patty, Sarah, we are the ones, all you mothers and fathers, children listening right now, we are the ones who can make the change. We are the ones who can say something, be the one to protect the children when they come to us, and be a good example, and exhibit those fruits of the spirit to where your kids are going to want to come to you and feel safe coming to you, and then know you're going to actually protect them when they do come to you. And what advice would you give to parents out there? I'll open it up to both of you. What's on your mind of what parents can be doing to make sure that their kids are protected?
I mean, I think like what you said is good. If Patty, asked her kids how they, what they liked and didn't like about school. And it's funny because I did the same thing with my kids. But being able to talk to your kids is so important because, you know, growing up the way we did, it was you didn't show your feelings
Right.
really. You definitely did not ever say how you felt. It wasn't like, you were never validated whether it was how you felt or what you thought because you were told what to feel. You were told what to think, you were told every move to make.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, I thank God that I had my mom because I did, know that I could tell her and she wasn't, going to kick me to the curb. She believed me immediately. And but that's because we had communication. We talked, we spent time together. And so I knew that I at least had one person that I could talk to. But some of the other red flags are just, I remember just totally isolating myself, like I was shy. I didn't want to talk to people.
Mm-hmm.
And because, I was ashamed of what had happened, or, maybe I wasn't good enough to be, Patty and I, we were not in the, it wasn't like we were allowed to be friends, like
Mm-hmm.
me and her probably could have been great friends, but it was almost like I wasn't allowed to be friends with her. um she couldn't be friends with me. And that when you start seeing that separation of, you know your kids are changing friends maybe, or
Mm-hmm.
isolating. We didn't have cell phones and computers back then, but spending a lot of time just like in their room with the door
Right.
shut. And
Right.
it's important for parents to let your kids know they can tell you anything. And I've told my kids that now because of the way I grew up. I don't care
Mm-hmm.
what you did. I don't care. You tell me and
Mm-hmm.
we'll take care of it, or I'm here for you. But I've done that since they were little,
Mm-hmm.
so that they know if something really was to happen, that I'm there for them and they can trust me and I will help them. So
Mm-hmm.
that's really important. Um,
Sarah, I
but
love that. And I want to add, because Patty had mentioned, you were referencing something Patty said earlier, and I thought this was so important. Like, Patty, I think you mentioned not getting mad when your kids are telling you things or not
Yeah.
reacting. I
Yeah.
think some parents do a great job of saying, "Yeah, come to me with anything. You can tell me anything."
right,
But they don't act in a way that makes you want to come tell them things, because when you
Yeah.
tell them, they just get mad at you. So it's like,
that's
okay, well, why
true.
am I going to tell my parents that? So I'm just
That
going to keep to myself. But people who don't talk have something to hide. And when something feels
Absolutely.
wrong, you're usually right.
And when they
So,
separate children from each other too, there's always a reason. I remember I
right.
wasn't allowed to talk to three boys in school at one point, but it was weird because I didn't even like boys like that at that point. And so separating friends, I love what you said about when they strip away your identity, the clothing, the hair that you feel good about.
Mm-hmm.
Um, in not allowing you to talk to certain people, or you were degrading yourself if you did talk to so and so, but you were on the great team if you were talking to the Sunday school teachers or the
Right.
pastors. So that was big.
Right. Like,
Mhm.
can we switch gears? This is kind of maybe a strange switch, but dating. You've touched on some like dating stuff that y'all experienced, and like things you could or couldn't do in dating. And I think parents, you know, I'm not even clear on the proper dating protocols and what I would recommend. I mean, I know what I went through, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend all of that, but what dating advice would you have for parents out there who are, giving their kid advice? Because like modesty, I don't think modesty is bad at all if
Right.
taught in the right way and not a weird perverted way.
Yeah.
Chaperoning your kids, like I don't think
Yes.
chaperoning your kids is bad necessarily, but
Mhm.
they need to know why you're chaperoning them, and it's to protect them, right, from
Right.
horrible experiences like what you went through, Sarah.
Mhm.
And it's so important to just understand dating, and I don't think it's taught. I don't think many people have any sort of idea what dating is supposed to look like. So I just want to hear, Patti and Sarah's opinions on dating. Like, what should dating look like? Do you have any thoughts?
Well, for me as a kid, everything was sexualized. Our
Mm,
clothing was picked at because it was this or that. We weren't supposed to talk to boys. I remember one of the youth pastor's daughters said she thought that people would get pregnant because the birds and the bees, but she literally thought a bird and a bee. So she didn't want to get stung by a bee on the playground.
wow.
So teaching your children, what sex really is, and it's okay, it's a good thing to have sex. Like I love sex, right?
Hmm.
Who doesn't, if it's done the proper way and if it's with somebody that you love. um so for transparency's sake, a lot of people don't know this about me. I ended up getting pregnant at 18 years old. I had no idea what love was. I did not love this guy at all. I guess like a friend sort of.
Hmm.
But I ended up getting a divorce like a year later. So I I knew right away like this relationship's not good. And then when I met Ken, a lot of people don't know this. I was only 20 years old. He bought me my first drink. I was 21 when I went out on my first date with Ken. And even looking back, like that, to be very completely honest, that I don't think I knew what I was doing at all. And everything's working out and all that stuff. Of course, we've been together for a long time, but I didn't know. So you're not taught to really get to know somebody because a lifetime is a long time. You look at
Hmm.
a relationship, if you're not taught the right way, you feel all these great feelings at first, right? You might be attracted to somebody, but if you don't really love them, then you're not going to be able to have that healthy relationship, and you're not taught to um, you're not taught to make decisions together when you grew up like Sarah and I did. So I was
Hmm.
always told you just have to listen to the man.
Hmm.
You don't have a say in your income really. And it wasn't even for me, it wasn't even until years later that I went off on my own as far as my career. I'm super passionate about having my own individuality.
Hmm.
I'm very passionate about wanting to work. And probably this is why, is because I wasn't ever raised where I could do that I can actually be free and have my thoughts and have my feelings
Hmm.
and be taught to actually know, first of all, what the heck sex is.
Hmm.
um, and then have a real relationship with somebody. You're taught to be separated from men and
Hmm.
boys, and then all of a sudden you're just supposed to marry somebody one day.
Yeah.
So
So something comes to mind that's just, you know, how can you know what's right? Like, how can you know the right way to date? How can you know what to teach your kids? Or how can you protect your kids from what other people might be teaching your kids? And
yeah,
and the
I
only
think
way is really to study yourself. And that's kind of a harsh truth of being a parent, I think, is realizing that it's really up to you to go learn and study and figure this stuff out, and make sure you're the one teaching your kids. And if someone else is with your kids all day, you know what they're teaching your kids, and you're asking those good questions. And if you don't know, then finding people that have good marriages, good, healthy, strong marriages that have those fruits of the spirit. And this is something that's been really hard for me because I've had to kind of, it's hard when you have been taking advice from people your whole life, and then you think to yourself, these people don't really have what I want in life at all, from a marriage perspective, from a money perspective, from a time perspective. It's like, okay, well, why do I listen to anything they're telling me? Right. And like, I think it applies so strongly here to parenting is it's like, okay, if I want to be a good parent, I need to find people that are great parents who have great kids. And they're hard to find, but they're there. And it's hard to know truly what's going on because everybody can hide stuff, right? But sorry,
No,
Patti, I
like
think you were
you.
going to jump in there and I might have talked over you.
No, that's fine. You know what you had mentioned at the beginning of your show about listening to your gut and your instinct. It's the same with your children. And to be very interactive with them and ask them what do they want in a relationship, because
Mm-hmm.
it's easy to tell your kid what they should and shouldn't do, but ask them,
Right.
like, what are some of the things that you're attracted to, and
Mm-hmm.
how do you get that, how do you get that in your relationships, not even just a dating relationship but your friendships. Do
Mm-hmm.
you want somebody who has a good job and who's going to do 50-50 with you, or do you want to end up with some guy who is like on the street and on drugs or something? Of course your kid's going to want what's best for themselves. And so talking to them about how to get there is really important. And
Mm-hmm.
even Sarah and I were talking about this, even the marriages that look great, sometimes they're not that great.
Right.
My parents argued like cats and dogs until finally, they left the situation we were in. So they would argue all the way to church, yelling and screaming. And then we would get to church and they're like, hi, how are you? I mean,
It's very relatable, Patti. It's very
yeah,
relatable.
I
yeah.
think another thing that's important is, I don't have any daughters, but I have four boys, and just to start instilling in them very young that they are worth something, like they're valuable. Like I was never taught my own, I was never taught my own self-worth. It was
Right.
the only way I can put it into words, like, it was what you wore and what you did and all these other things. But, I was never, if I did do something right, it was never, that was never acknowledged. Not that, we have to acknowledge every single good thing our kids do. But on the other hand, when you believe in your heart and in your head that you touch a boy, you're going to hell, what you wear is going to hell, all these things, you feel really bad about yourself,
Mm-hmm.
like I, after this happened with me, and I could see this boy pushing these boundaries, but, you know, I didn't think I was worth it. Like I didn't think it mattered, I didn't think at that point it mattered anymore. And I mean, I'm kind of like Patti. I mean, I got married when I was 20.
Mm-hmm.
I don't even know, like, I didn't really even know this guy. I just did it because he asked me to marry him. And I was like, wow, maybe I am important to somebody, And so teaching our kids when they're little, these things
Mm-hmm.
like, I, as a parent, I don't love you because of what you wear or what you, do. I just love you because I'm your mom,
Mm-hmm.
just like God loves us. Like, I just love you. It's not conditional. And
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I feel for me, I was really taught this conditional love because,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if I got, a bad grade, I was in trouble, if I, whatever it was. I mean, if you weren't walking that line exactly like they wanted you
Mm-hmm.
to, you were already bad. Like,
Right.
like bad, like you're bad, you're bad. Like, how many times were we told, even when I was little, well, you're bad, you're
Right.
bad, maybe what I did was bad, maybe what I did was wrong, maybe, I hit my
Mm-hmm.
sister or something, but, that was just ingrained that I was a bad person, and
Right.
then after this happened, it didn't get any better because nobody would help me
Mm-hmm.
work through it. And so I was like, you know what, I must really be a crappy person. By the time I got to college, I had no, like, I had no self-worth. I didn't think I was worthy of anything good.
Right.
And and that's had consequences for the past, 20 years of my life, where I don't think
Mm-hmm.
I'm good enough, and so I just take whatever I get, and it's for the most part not been very good.
So two
And
two
so,
huge things, Sarah. I love that you said conditional love because I think I was listening to Ed Milet's podcast recently with the School of Greatness guy. Ed, you know who I'm kicking myself because I don't remember his name, but he was actually molested as a young man. So, we've been talking all women here, and this stuff happens to boys too, right? The Catholic Church, hello, like,
Yeah.
these things happen, and there's no such thing. They were talking about love, and they said there's no such thing as conditional love, and I was just it, like, struck me, because anything that's conditional is not love.
That's
Love
right.
is always unconditional. And so knowing that we have a loving father, and I don't think I really even knew what love was of like a loving father until I was a father. And I lay with my baby girl in my arms, and I just look at her, and she just talks to me. And like, just thinking about how our God wants us to pray to him and talk to him. And I sat there listening to my baby girl talk to me, and I'm just like, oh man, I could just listen to her talk to me all night long. Like, I just love it. And I like that unconditional love of a father, of a mother, of a child, to see that perverted is just so horrible. And just to know how much we are loved. And you, Sarah Kennedy, and you, Patti Katter, are loved by an all-loving God who sent his son to die for you, right? To know that, to know that he covered all our sins, all the things that, the bad things we did, that some of what you did probably weren't bad, but um just to know that, and to know that now we're free to go live and help other people like you're doing on this podcast, and to share your story, and to know that even though you went through those horrible things, he's going to work it for your good and the good of those who love and trust in him. And who knows how many lives you're going to help through your story and sharing it. So thank you so much for being willing to share your story, to share your heart, to share your advice, your wisdom that came through much adversity. And the other point that I think is so huge that you said is just creating an environment and giving your kids an identity where they're comfortable questioning and speaking up. If you're in an environment, anybody, even adults, right? If you're in an environment where people don't want you to question anything, red flag, right? That's a big, big problem. And so I think, I thought those 2 points you said, Sarah, were just incredible. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah.
All right, ladies, this has been very deep. Lots of good stuff. My little baby just walked in. Come here, Aria. Come here, lady. You want to come on the show? She's going to be shy. Come on. Leaving me hanging. It would have been such a good ending. It's still a good ending. Sarah, Patti, I got to ask you, because it's the last question. If y'all aren't following Patti and Sarah, go follow them. You can find Patti Katter, PattiKatter.com. You can find Sarah Kennedy at Sarah with an H on Facebook. Go reach out to them. Tell them how much you love this episode. Thank them for what they're doing, sharing their story. It's not easy. It's very uncomfortable to share personal things like this, but it's so powerful because I know hearing these stories, if, like I said at the beginning, righteous anger, hearing how these little girls were manipulated, and knowing that there's dozens, hundreds, maybe thousands more that have been through that same ordeal, not just in that one spot, right? Not to mention the hundreds of thousands, millions around the world that experience these things. It makes me sick. It makes me angry, in a righteous anger. And as a part of GLE, what we're doing is we're creating a mastermind of people who are going to be around the world changing environments so that they're not toxic, they're not false, they're not hypocritical, and they're full of truth, faith, love, and courage. So I'm going to ask Sarah, I'll ask you to go first, and then Patti, I'll wrap with you. If there's one thing you want to leave the world with for future generations, I always ask this on the show. It's a little differently framed today, maybe, but who knows who's going to see this down the road, right? 3, 4, 5 generations. Our great grandkids might be watching this someday. It'd be cool. What would you want to leave them with? One piece of advice. Doesn't have to even be related to this topic, but if it can relate, that's great. But what would you want to leave them with today?
Oh, goodness, advice. I think a big thing is to understand who your God is. the God I grew up with is not who God is. And, the Bible says God is our father, right? And, what does a loving father do? How does a loving father act? That's the kind of God that you need to believe in. It's not the God that, is going to send you to hell because, you've done something, maybe it's something you need to apologize for, but just knowing that God is a loving God. And, I one time wrote out a list of what I thought God was, just off the top of my head, and me and Patti, we had to recite catechism, so
Mm-hmm.
I know all this. God is love, just, holy, pure, like I had a big old list. And then and it was actually my husband who had talked to me about this, when we started dating, we were talking about God, and he's like, okay, now put that list to the side, write out a list of God, but as God your father, God, what is God to you? And I'm like, okay, well, that's different. A good father protects me. God protects us every day from things we may not even know, or a good father's forgiving. And that changing my thoughts on God has done more for me than anything. I mean, I'm like Patti, I have a panic attack if I'm going into church sometimes, but knowing that I'm thankful. I'm so thankful that the God I grew up with is not how God is.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's just a huge piece of advice because, like you said, the fruits of the Spirit. I mean, I've got a plaque with the fruits of the Spirits on it because you got to know what to look for. You got
Right.
to know who God is. And I just think that that's so important,
Mm-hmm.
being, going to church is good, going to church is great. But if you're not really learning about God and how how God cares about us, and it's so important. Like, we grew up just I grew up thought God hated me. I straight up I thought God hated me. And when I was able to finally work through some of this stuff and change my thinking and realize, what, God doesn't hate me, God loves
Mm-hmm.
me, and start looking to God as my father instead of just this figure that, you were supposed to obey, which really was, we were supposed to obey the men, the adult figures. I
Mm-hmm.
just think that's so important. God is, you know, if you're questioning who God is, like I did, I really sat down and I dug deep into my soul and, versus what I was taught versus how God really is. You know, I, I was able to see the difference. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that's, if you can do that, that affects your kids, that affects your grandkids, that
Mm-hmm.
affects future generations, like you said, to not keep, these false ideas got to stop somewhere, right? And I'm
100%.
glad that you asked me on here because that is a huge desire of my heart is to help people see that, you know, God is there and he may not be the same God you grew up with, but that's okay. That for me, that was the best thing that ever happened in my life. I mean, there were times I was suicidal, and if I would have known that God loved me and truly believed that that may not have happened. I may not have,
Right.
had those suicidal thoughts or, and it's all because of this, but because of the way we grew up. So
Mm-hmm.
for me, that's a real big thing,
I
for
love that.
other people to really study it for yourself. Don't listen
Right.
to somebody else. Do it for
Yes.
yourself.
Yes. That is a truth bomb from Sarah
Yes.
Kennedy.
Yes.
Study to show thyself approved. Seek and you
Right.
will find. You seek it out. You need
Right.
to know. You need to know so you can question. Because
Right.
otherwise, there's no way you don't. There's no way to know if you're being lied to unless you know.
Right.
Patti, what about you?
So a lot of people ask me, how do you stay so positive? How come you're so nice? Well, now you know. It's because I am strong-willed and very hard-headed. And I did come up in a background where I never thought I was good enough as far as from the school and church standpoint. Now, let me tell you real quick, as I got older, my relationship with my parents was amazing. They were my very, very best friends
Mm-hmm.
after we got out of that environment. But during the time I was in that environment, I never heard things like, you're beautiful, you're amazing, you're these great things. So if you're listening to this and you don't know it, you're amazing, you're beautiful, you're kind, you're worth it. Don't let anybody else tell you that you're not worth it. Don't let anybody else tell you these negative things, because you are amazing. Just remember that. If that's the last thing you remember today, just remember you are amazing. You're a gift.
You are amazing. And you two ladies are amazing for coming on the show. Thank you so much, Sarah Kennedy, Patti Katter, for coming on the show and sharing your heart with the GLE network today.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Hey, all you listeners out there, go follow Patti and Sarah and share out this show. So there's a lot of people that need to hear this topic. It's really important. So as you go lead everything, share the show, and I hope you all have a good one.